Pearl Harbor, which killed 2,409 and wounded 1,700, shocked the American public. They couldn't believe the United States military had suffered such a defeat at the hands of the Japanese. This sneak attack plunged America into war. But the events of December 7th, 1941 cannot be isolated from the escalating war in Europe.
President Roosevelt, quite rightly, wanted to stop Hitler, but Hitler refused to bite. I discovered indications that we knew the Japanese were coming. And I can only surmise that he figured, well, we'll let them come in, they can't do us any harm, this will get us into a war, and Hitler will get into the war, and then we can defeat Hitler.
Even with the increasing threat of Germany, half the country still favored isolationism. One of the closest contacts to President Roosevelt was his eldest son, James Roosevelt.
I don't think he ever had any idea that there would be a direct attack as there was on Pearl Harbor. And I think he envisioned that there would always be an element of opposition to the war, and realized that if we were actually attacked, of course, the situation would be entirely different. And when the attack came, it did unify the country without any respect, any question.
At the Imperial Ministry in Tokyo, Japanese leaders were elated. Their strike force had crippled America's Pacific Fleet and demoralized American spirits. But the Japanese had overlooked two important targets, the dry docks and the fuel storage tanks. America's ability to rebuild their Pacific Fleet would come back to haunt the Japanese and enable America to reverse the momentum of the war in the Pacific.
Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
As President Roosevelt declared war on Japan, Americans had little idea of the foe they were about to encounter.
The Japanese, when they went into war, they left their fingernails in an envelope, they left a lock of their hair, they said goodbye to their relatives. They went to die for the emperor. When a GI went to war, he went to save his butt and to come back home.
Americans united behind the war effort. Young men rushed to enlist, and factories quickly converted to the production of war supplies. Starting America's war machine took time, and the Japanese were already well organized. On December 8th, just hours after crippling the American fleet, the Japanese attacked and destroyed U.S. air bases in the Philippines. Ralph Cedillo survived this early morning bombing.
The Americans were asleep. They should have had something over there telling us that the airplanes were on the way to bomb us, but they didn't tell us, you know. Well, they caught us by surprise. We were eating, and when they start bombs falling all over, and they start strafing and everything.
Within a matter of hours, America's Pacific Air Force and Naval Fleet had been neutralized. General MacArthur, leader of Allied ground forces in the Philippines, had no choice but to retreat to the Bataan Peninsula and the island of Corregidor.
Lack of forces, lack of food, lack of ammunition. We had no way of getting ammunition, no way of getting food. For a while, we were on 2 meals a day. That cereal with magnets, you know, worms in the cereal. We had to eat it because you only get 2 meals a day. We were retreating. We had no choice but to retreat, pull back, until they had us almost in the water.
On December 8th, the Japanese also invaded Malaya, encountering tough resistance by British forces. The fall of Singapore on February the 15th, 1942 proved an important conquest for the Japanese. It gave them easy access to the abundant oil reserves and natural resources in the Dutch East Indies. As Americans followed the grim news of Japanese conquests, many of these remote Pacific islands became household words. The war in the Pacific encompassed a vast area, ranging from Hawaii on the east, as far west as the Dutch East Indies, north to Japan, and all the way south to Australia. Decisions in America's war with Germany often influenced the events in the Pacific. One in particular would become extremely important. In 1941, US intelligence reported Germany was importing large quantities of uranium, an important material in creating a nuclear chain reaction. This convinced Roosevelt of the importance of a US program to develop an atomic bomb. With government support, the best American and German refugee scientists were assembled to work on the Manhattan Project. Dr. Robert Christie was involved throughout the program.
A lot of the scientists who were involved in the initial work felt that the Germans would be working on this program, and they were very fearful that the Germans would achieve a nuclear reaction before we would. And so their intensity was indeed spurred by worries about the Germans.
By mid-February 1942, the Allies' supply ships were unable to penetrate the Japanese naval blockade of the Philippines. Troops were down to 2 rations a day. Malaria was running rampant, and the supplies of quinine, malaria's treatment, were almost gone. The soldiers were tired of retreating, but had no choice. In March, President Roosevelt ordered MacArthur to Australia to organize Allied forces for an offensive against Japan.
I said to the people of the Philippines whence I came, I shall return.
No matter what the circumstances, retreating from the Philippines humiliated this proud general, but would serve as his incentive for its recapture 2 years later. In April 1942, Japanese forces overwhelmed the Allies in Bataan. Under the command of General Jonathan Wainwright, 75,000 Allied troops surrendered to the Japanese. It was the largest United States military force to surrender in history. General Masahara Homma accepted the unconditional surrender and was also responsible for the atrocities that followed as American troops were taken prisoner.
Oh, it was horrible. Well, they were dying like flies because we were starving, and they were dying, no water and no food. The Japanese were very brutal. They shouldn't shoot someone, then they run over the truck with the trucks and everything, just like nothing.
These malaria-infected troops were forced to march 65 miles in tropical heat with no food or water. If they protested or fainted, they were immediately executed. Those who made it to the brutal prison camps often wished that they had died on the road.
So they threw me in the dungeon for 7.5 months. My beard was this long. I didn't shave or anything. Then for a bath, once a month, there was a pipe, coming out of a pipe like this, run through there. And that was really brutal. That was, when they took me out, I was half dead.
25,000 soldiers died along the 65-mile trek. Another 22,000 died during the first 2 months of the camp. This inhumane treatment of prisoners became known as the Bataan Death March, one of the darkest chapters in America's war with Japan. April 18th, 1942, Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle led a group of 16 B-25s on a daring bombing raid over various targets in Japan.
There was considerable risk. The likelihood of us being able to achieve our mission and get away unscathed which we did, was almost a miracle.
Shortly after Pearl Harbor, the idea of a retaliatory raid on Japan was suggested to Roosevelt, but the logistics were almost impossible. To take an aircraft carrier close enough to Japan to accommodate the short range of normal carrier fighter planes would place that aircraft carrier at serious risk of being detected with no cover that far from home. Doolittle helped modify 16 B-25s, which had a much longer range than regular carrier aircraft, so the carrier could remain at a safe distance from Japanese radar and reconnaissance. The carrier Hornet was chosen for the mission, and the normally land-based B-25s were modified to take off from its short carrier deck.
There were really two objectives, and both of those objectives were achieved. One objective was to give the American people the first good news that they had had in the war so far. And the other objective was to cause the Japanese to question their warlords who had assured them Japan would never be attacked.
After the raid, the planes continued on to China. Many crash-landed. Doolittle was later awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor and promoted to Brigadier General. America's first war hero resulted from a bombing mission that failed to inflict any serious damage, but it provided a badly needed morale boost for the Americans, skeptical because of all the setbacks in the Pacific. The raid also set the stage for America's first major victory.
It brought the Battle of Midway on before the Japanese were really prepared to handle it properly. And that hurry-up job was our first real success.
Shortly before the Doolittle bombing raid, the Imperial Navy submitted a plan to engage the U.S. Pacific Fleet in a battle for Midway Island. They hoped to wipe out America's Pacific Fleet, then capture Midway Island and Hawaii, and eliminate the threat of U.S. naval resistance in the Pacific. But first, they attempted to capture Port Moresby in New Guinea as a base for invading Australia. On May 7th and 8th, 1942, the Battle of the Coral Sea became the first aircraft carrier battle in history. Randolph Wood served on the carrier Yorktown during that battle.
The Coral Sea battle, it definitely kept Australia from being invaded because the invasion forces was en route, and it turned it back. And it was a surprise that we were there. Once they located us and knew that we were there, they turned everything they had on us instead of going into Australia. And that's really what saved Australia from being invaded.
The Battle of the Coral Sea was considered a draw. Both sides sank a carrier and badly damaged another. For the Allied forces, it was a moral victory. For the Japanese, it was the first time they had failed to achieve their objective. Japanese news reported the battle as their victory. Political and military leaders began to believe their own propaganda. They were overconfident and underestimated the American will. When the carrier Yorktown limped back into Pearl Harbor from the Coral Sea, it was estimated repairs would take 3 months. Admiral Nimitz needed this carrier in 3 weeks for the Battle of Midway. The repairing of the Yorktown was one of the great success stories of the war. Herman Hastrup headed the civilian salvage unit.
He asked us if it would be possible to put it back in operation in 3 weeks. And after looking at each other and looking at and talking a little about it, I was the one that said to Admiral Nimitz, if we get the human resources and the material that's required to do the job, we can have it ready in 3 weeks.
As the Japanese naval force approached Midway, they were overconfident. Sure, they were about to launch another surprise attack with the ease of Pearl Harbor half a year earlier. Little did they know, American naval intelligence had broken every Japanese code and was monitoring their fleet's movements and plans. Japan lacked an intelligence network since the Americans had severed their espionage chain on Oahu after the Pearl Harbor attack. With a total of 86 Japanese fighting ships, including 6 carriers versus 27 ships and 3 carriers for the United States, the Battle of Midway was one of the few occasions during the war the Americans were underdogs. But it was imperative they win, for if not, the U.S. fleet would have no ships to stave off a Japanese assault on Hawaii.
There was an urgency out there someplace, but we didn't know where. But within 3 hours after we were cleared to breakwater, the skipper came on and told us exactly what was up, where it was, what our odds were, and the whole thing.
With the aid of superior intelligence, Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance maneuvered the Pacific Fleet into position for the battle. On June 4th, 5th and 6th, 1942, both sides launched aerial attacks on the opposing fleet. No gunfire was exchanged directly between ships. With good weather and a little luck, the outnumbered American fleet scored a resounding victory. Japan lost 4 carriers, a heavy cruiser, and over 300 aircraft. America lost 1 destroyer and a carrier, the Yorktown. The American Midway victory boosted troop morale and reversed the momentum, enabling the Allies to take the offensive for the first time in the Pacific. The victory at the Battle of Midway enabled the Allied forces to take the offensive for the first time in the Pacific. The Army's General Douglas MacArthur commanded the Southwest Pacific, which included Australia, New Guinea, the Dutch East Indies, and the Philippines. Admiral Nimitz of the Navy took charge of the Central Pacific, including the Eastern Solomon Islands, the Gilbert Islands, the Marshall Islands, and the Marianas. Their objective was to mop up Japanese island fortresses, recapture the Philippines, and get within striking distance for bombing raids on Japan. These hot, muggy, tropical islands posed some new challenges for American troops. James Roosevelt, the president's eldest son, served as commanding officer of the 4th Marine Battalion in the Pacific.
In the first place, you were subject to the kind of diseases which were prevalent in the area, like malaria. And of course, the weather was hot and humid, and an awful lot. When it rained, it didn't rain, it poured. And especially in the jungle areas, this made life pretty difficult.
The Japanese were experienced jungle fighters. American troops were not. And that inexperience further hampered America's Pacific campaign. Chris Gugas spent 3 years with the Marines and fought 5 major battles from Guadalcanal to Iwo Jima.
Don't forget that we didn't have very much jungle fighting except in Nicaragua back in 1921 and 22 when the Marines went in there. But the Japanese were not only tenacious jungle fighters, I mean, they took advantage of camouflage, which we knew very little about.
In early August of 1942, America staged its first offensive. 7,000 Marines captured a newly completed airfield on Guadalcanal. This uncontested battle was vital for Americans in order to stop Japan's advances towards Australia. Tom Lamphere was stationed with the Army Air Force on Guadalcanal.
Miserable, miserable. It was a horrible place. The physical conditions were awful. It was a pouring rain or steaming heat, the stinking of bodies, but it was just a horrible place to live. It was a blessing to get off it and fly somewhere, even if you're going to get shot at.
Nature proved to be as tough a foe as the Japanese fighting forces. After 6 months of tenacious fighting, the United States Army Air Force, Navy, and Marines prevailed, thwarting Japan's attempt to capture the island. Harold Weinberger served as a combat photographer in Guadalcanal.
The ones that opposed us were excellent. They were comparable to the Marines in their spirit, to our Marines in their spirit and tenacity. And of course, their philosophy was entirely different from ours. But the Japanese just plugged on, fighting to the last man almost. And prisoners were a very scarce commodity because of their desire to fight to the end.
Over 25,000 Japanese died trying to recapture this tiny island. Their biggest loss was in the air. They lost 600 planes.
Towards the tail end of the war, they didn't have the planes nor the gasoline to train them in, and they got pretty bad towards the end of the line. Of course, that's understandable. You got to train people or they can't perform. And of course, they ran out of nearly everything as the war went along.
At the same time the Japanese were trying to recapture Guadalcanal, they were driving on Port Moresby in New Guinea. From there, they hoped to capture Australia. By mid-1942, MacArthur was able to mount an offensive with a joint force of Australian and American troops. Progress was slower than MacArthur intended, but the Allied forces prevailed, with the campaign culminating in Papua. The Japanese lost their entire 13,000-man army. Only 38 prisoners of war were taken. the end of 1942, Allied forces were rolling. At home, America's industrial war machine replenished lost equipment and supplies, but Japanese industry couldn't keep up with their losses. The lack of trained pilots and equipment handicapped Japan, but failed to deter their spirit to fight for the emperor and their country.
The Japanese were fighting for existence, and a man or an animal that is fighting for existence does not suddenly say as he's losing, well, I'm going to quit. You don't say I surrender. The Japanese thought surrender was cowardly.
Allied victories at Midway, Guadalcanal and Papua proved bittersweet. They reversed the tragedy of Pearl Harbor and the Bataan Death March. They gave Allied forces momentum. But everyone realized the tremendous price both sides would have to pay to end the war.